Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to Neil Thurgood, Senior Vice President at Anduril, about the rapid pace of growth in military technology, whether soldiers trust that technology, and how it's changing military tactics and strategy. And then we break down the possibility that Chinese nationals are fighting alongside the Russians in Ukraine, what to expect from the U.S. Iran nuclear talks, and much more. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and I'm joined, as always, by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times. We have retired Army Lieutenant General Neil Thurgood coming up later on the show. He's a senior vice president at Anduril and the former head of the Army's Rapid Capabilities and Critical Technology Office. So a great conversation there about military technology, the use of robots, how the Pentagon can and should streamline its contract and acquisition processes, and much more. But before we get to that interview, first things first, as always, Guy, what's on your radar right now?
Thanks, Ben. It's great to be here for another week with you on the podcast. There are several things I'm tracking right now. The first is the question of whether Chinese military troops or some group of Chinese mercenaries are now fighting on the ground alongside and in support of Russian forces inside eastern Ukraine. This question reared its head in recent days, Ben, when Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky suddenly announced on April 8th that the Ukrainian military had captured two Chinese nationals among Russian troops fighting in the Donetsk region, and that Kiev has intelligence pointing to a much larger contingent of Chinese forces inside Ukraine. Zelensky did not offer more details than that, but his claim sparked major speculation. It's possible that the Russian military scoops up whoever it can, and that these could be ethnically Chinese people or Chinese nationals that just joined. That being said, Ben, within hours of Zelensky's claim, the Chinese government was denying that it has authorized any Chinese individuals, military or otherwise, to partner on the ground with Russian forces in Ukraine. A Chinese foreign ministry spokesman actually said Zelensky's allegation has no basis in facts. Beijing has consistently sought to portray its posture as neutral toward Russia's invasion of Ukraine, although China has emerged over the last 2 years as a key provider of materials for Russian weapons production and a buyer of Russian energy, oil and gas. What's interesting here is that Russian forces are actually buttressed now by more than 10,000 North Korean troops. And North Korea, by the way, is a formal military treaty ally of China. So while it's unclear here whether Zelensky has bad information or disinformation or misinformation, the reality is that if China suddenly does have mercenaries or some military individuals on the ground supporting the Russian military, it could be a massive shift to the geopolitical dynamics surrounding the war and President Trump's push for a ceasefire. We're tracking it in the Threat Status daily newsletter, Ben. On a separate front, I was following closely Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's trip to Panama on April 9 to participate in the 2025 Central American Security Conference. In opening remarks at that conference, Hegseth held no punches in criticizing what he called China's growing influence in the region. He told the crowd that the Chinese military has, quote, too large of a presence in the Western Hemisphere, end quote. He basically accused Beijing of openly operating in the region to try and gain a military advantage over the U.S. and take advantage of smaller Latin American countries for economic gain. This was interesting, Ben. because Hegseth is the one now pushing this narrative from the Trump administration. We saw Secretary of State Marco Rubio pushing it in early February when he visited Panama. This is the second major cabinet level visit to Panama for the Trump administration. Remember, President Trump has more or less said he wants the U.S. to control the Panama Canal. It's clearly a major policy priority for Trump at this point to counter China in the Western Hemisphere. My question is, how does this kind of Cold War style posturing impact the now spiraling trade and tariff war between the U.S. and China? A quick note on that, Ben. We saw China rapidly retaliate against Trump's expanding tariffs in recent days, and we saw Trump now vowing to impose more than 100% tariffs on Chinese goods entering the United States. We're tracking all of that as well in the Threat Status newsletter. Finally, Ben, there are a lot of questions swirling in national security circles right now over the extent to which President Trump is moving toward what could be some really significant changes to the U.S. intelligence community. At issue specifically was the president's sudden firing last week of National Security Agency NSA Director Air Force General Timothy Ho. There's a lot of mystery and hand-wringing over why Trump suddenly removed General Ho. Listeners can go ahead and Google Laura Loomer Trump NSA firing, and they'll see the allegation that an online conspiracy influencer may have been involved in meeting Trump about this. A key thing here, though, Ben, from the bigger picture, is that General Ho was the director of both the NSA and U.S. Cyber Command at the Pentagon. This is a dual role that past NSA directors have held. For those who are wondering, Trump has tapped Army Lieutenant General William Hartman as acting director of both agencies now, but the whole development has sparked speculation, at least this is what we're hearing from threat status sources, that the president may be moving toward a bigger shift in which he separates this dual role and may try to put civilian leadership atop the NSA. We're tracking it at threat status along with all the implications, Ben, given the NSA's prowess as the leading signals intelligence spying agency tapping communications among U.S. adversaries and individuals overseas.
We're going to get into contracts and some other wonky in the weeds policy talk with Neil Thurgood from Anduril here in a minute, but I want to highlight something else briefly that broke last night related to some of this. President Trump signed an executive order to reform America's foreign defense sales system. This executive order directs the State Department and the Department of Defense to improve speed and accountability by reducing delays, improving efficiency, and enhancing the ability of allies to get defense technologies faster. This means essentially the U.S. is trying to make it faster and easier for the government and its private industry partners to get weapons and other capabilities out the door faster to allies. For example, Israel or Ukraine, to name a few that are at war right now. These are foreign military sales, of course, not gifts, but most countries do want to pay and are willing to do so for weapons and other military assets made here in the U.S. The process is often too slow, and this is a recognition of that. Now, one of the countries, as I said, that relies heavily on U.S. military aid is Israel, and that alliance was very much in the spotlight this week when Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu visited the White House and met with President Trump, and it was during their joint appearance that President Trump revealed the U.S. would be having direct talks with Iran over its nuclear program. This is set to take place in Oman on Saturday with U.S. Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff scheduled to talk to the Iranian foreign minister, though there's still some uncertainty about whether these are actual face-to-face direct talks or if officials from Oman will act as intermediaries, shuffling back and forth between the two sides. We'll see how that shakes out over the next 48 hours heading into the weekend. But nevertheless, it's a big deal. The U.S. and Iran talking about Iran's nuclear program a decade plus after the Obama era JCPOA nuclear deal that Donald Trump walked away from during his first term. There's just an endless number of questions here that I piloted some of them in the Washington Times this week. What does the U.S. really want? Do we insist on dismantling entirely Iran's ability to produce plutonium or to enrich uranium? Do we want the complete shutdown of heavy water reactors? What about Iran's ballistic missile program? Do we push for a halt in its financial support for Hamas or the Houthis? Or Do we dangle major private economic U.S. investment in Iran in addition to the lifting of government sanctions if we can make a deal? We'll see about all of that. So I'll be watching closely to see what happens, if anything, on Saturday.
It's incredibly interesting, Ben. Your summary is so lucid. I just want to point out, remember during President Trump's first term, his high stakes summits with the North Koreans. And I'm wondering at this point, and we're tracking it, we haven't seen much reaction from Pyongyang, a very closed authoritarian media state there. But how is the Kim Jong-un regime watching this? And was that slate of summits that Trump had with Kim that ultimately failed to produce a major agreement on North Korea's nuclear weapons program, did that set any kind of a precedent here going into these talks? Are the Iranians studying that now to see, what could we get from Trump as an offer economically? It's pretty interesting.
It is. You have to think that they probably are. And it's apropos that you bring up North Korea, because one other thing kind of hanging over this that really caught my eye is just how Trump, the negotiator, is operating on multiple fronts with respect to the axis of authoritarians or axis of tyranny that you kind of referenced earlier: China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. We've got these talks with Iran. You mentioned past diplomacy by Trump with North Korea. We have ceasefire negotiations, direct talks with Russia over the war in Ukraine, a major standoff over tariffs with China. We'll see where that goes. We've talked on this show, and you and I recently talked to former CIA clandestine services officer Dan Hoffman about the wedge strategy. Does the Trump administration try to go at the axis in some way to divide them? And I wonder, with all of these kind of disparate parts here, all of these different talks with members of that axis, is this a part of that strategy? Is it playing out now? Do you say to Iran, you need to stop providing drones to Russia for its war in Ukraine as any part of a nuclear deal? Do you say to Russia, as any part of a ceasefire deal, that it might strike no more nuclear cooperation in any way, shape, or form with North Korea or with Iran? There's a lot of balls in the air here, Guy, and I do wonder if there are avenues that are kind of opening up right now before our eyes if the administration wants to be creative and maybe a little aggressive in terms of trying to drive wedges into that axis and weaken it over time.
Absolutely, Ben. I think that that is a policy of the Trump administration, is to try and embrace this wedge strategy approach. The issue becomes that the wedge strategy idea, it could be easy to talk about in a graduate school course about geopolitics or grand strategy of the United States, when in reality, these are active players in a great power game on the world stage right now. And we don't know, our U.S. intelligence is struggling to determine accurately what the actual tissue of connectivity is across the so-called dime, the diplomatic, informational, military, and economic spheres between China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. So if Trump pursues a wedge strategy and says to the Iranians, we want you to do this vis-a-vis Russia, or says to the Russians, we want you to do this vis-a-vis China, that's great. But the reality is we don't know how those countries are communicating with each other behind the scenes and possibly running their own collective autocratic great power strategy against the United States.
Yeah, it's a great point, because we often talk about the wedge strategy as if we're having a secret conversation that the members of the Axis are unaware of. They're very much aware that the wedge strategy has become a part of diplomatic lexicon and sort of national security conversations in the U.S. too. So that's worth keeping in mind. And we are joined now by Dr. Neil Thurgood, Senior Vice President at Anduril, where he oversees the Air and Ground Deterrence Division. Neil spent 37 years in the Army, retiring as a lieutenant general, and was director of the Army's Rapid Capabilities and Critical Technology Officer, the RCCTO, as it's called. I'm excited to talk about that here in a minute, Neil. It's a very impressive resume. Thank you so much for joining us here in the Threat Status Podcast.
Well, Ben, thanks, and thanks to the team for having me today. Super great honor to be here. Look forward to the discussion and maybe what we can contribute. So thank you.
Of course. Well, let's start with this, because with nearly 4 decades in the Army and working at the RCCTO, you've really been at the forefront of technological advancement in sort of the military and national security space for a long time. And now you're at Anduril, of course, a company that's also at the forefront of that in unmanned systems, autonomous systems, surveillance, and more that we'll get into in a little bit. But from your perch, I'm just curious, what's the pace of technological advancement been like to watch? I mean, we always hear, oh, things are moving so much faster than they ever have before. Is that actually true, or is there recency bias at play here with that? What's your read on just the pace of where we are technologically today?
Now, it's a great question. And let me just start by saying, certainly an honor to serve our nation, for 4 decades. Great opportunity for our family. And so we really feel honored by that and grateful for the chance we had to serve. The adaptation of technology it happens at different paces during different times. And sometimes in peacetime, we may appear to be going slower than we might desire. And in crisis, we tend to go really fast. And so there's a pace and an outline to how technology adaptation happens inside the department. At the end of the day, though, the adaptation of technology has to have two key relevant outcomes. Number one, it is technology that is useful to the warfight, right? There's a lot of great technology out there. Not every piece of technology helps you fight wars. And so finding the technology that is useful for the warfighter is the number one priority. And then adapting that technology so that it can actually be used by a soldier. And when I say soldier, I mean a service member of any of the services that can actually apply it in an operational scenario. And the technology has a relevance also by domain, right? If you look at helicopter technology versus missile technology versus high energy laser technologies, those technology domains progress at different speeds. And so you may not have the same relevant speed of technologies, but you have the same level of advanced technology, even though they're happening at different paces, if that makes sense.
I want to ask one more question here about the Rapid Capabilities Office, because I was at the AUSA Global Force Symposium in Huntsville a couple weeks ago, as I know you were as well. One of the most interesting things I saw there was a presentation about human-machine integrated formations, which the Army says they plan to field by 2027. This, of course, centers on sending robots, drones, other unmanned systems into combat zones ahead of humans or into a dangerous building, using a robot to deal with ordnance. The idea of not wanting to trade blood for first contact with the enemy, as the Army says. In your experience, do soldiers trust the machines as much as they trust a human, or will they in the future? Are we at a point where a soldier can look at a robot and say, I trust this thing as much as I trust the woman or man in uniform beside me to go defuse a bomb, that if they do a bad job, I might die? Are we at that point where the trust is there in these things?
Yeah, and I think it's a really interesting point, the human-machine interface. And when we think about that interface, there's kind of two general approaches people take. One is, how do I replace a human task with a machine task? And what might be a dangerous task, can I actually do that with a machine of some sort? And then what's the complexity of that task? The second, and I think the more advanced thought of that is, it's not how I replace humans with machines. It's how do I use the combination of humans and machines for a better outcome? That's a different approach, right? It's not just replacing tasks. It's how do I do the task better with the adaptation of machines and machine-human interface with a soldier. When in the conversations that I've been having with the Army on that, being a technologist at heart, is really the advanced thought is how do I use that machine to make the job of the human better and stronger and more efficient, not how I replace humans with machines. That's two different thought processes. The adaptation of technology, robotics, in particular autonomy, in the Army, and I'll say the Marine Corps, is a little bit different than it is in the Navy or the Air Force. And what I mean by that is, in the Army, the fight for us is very personal. It's an up close fight. We see the enemy. We see the impact of what we're doing to the enemy. That the distance and proximity of the fight's a little different for the Army than it is for the Air Force and for the Navy, and how they actually engage the fight. Regardless of that, though, the key point of trust and autonomy is, and I don't think we can ever walk away from this. We have a value-based military. We make value-based decisions in combat, and when we engage and when we don't engage, and when robots can help us do that quicker and faster and more efficiently, then we like to bring that in, and we use it all the time. Remember, robots aren't new to the Army by any stretch, right? We've had, you at the very base level, you can say that a mine in a mine field is a robot, right? It lays out there until something happens, and then it causes a reaction to happen. And so as we bring the adaptation of robotics, I think that the generation that is now coming into the military is much more likely to have a positive adaptation than us older people. So I think there is a generational piece to the adaptation of technology. And I'll give you an example. When we built the directed energy weapon systems, the first ones for the Army, which are now fielded and used in operational outcomes, we actually chose the controlling mechanism of a high energy laser was actually a Game Boy controller. And we had this great training class to teach our soldiers how to use it. And it was over several days. And literally, about after the first day, the young NCOs and soldiers came up to us and go, "Hey, we're good. We understand how to do this. We're so used to adapting this technology and how to use it that we didn't actually need to give them the whole training class." So the younger generation is much more adaptive and accepting of technologies than the older generation. And that sounds a little bit biased to say it that way, having me be in the older generation and being a technologist, but I think we are trusting it more and more.
Neil, it's Guy Taylor. Given your breadth of experience as someone in the older generation, I'm quoting you. Let's talk big picture for a second, just about the American defense industry and its evolution. I'm hoping you can give us an inside look at partnerships and collaboration between new and emerging companies, which seem to be really a big part of the future of where the defense industrial sector is going. Over just the past few months, Anduril announced a partnership with Archer Aviation to build a hybrid propulsion vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. In December, Anduril also announced a major partnership with OpenAI focused on improving drone capabilities. There are other examples. Why are these kinds of collaborative projects important right now? One, and then two, do you see it that the overall landscape is shifting, perhaps away from major primes like Lockheed, Boeing, and Northrop Grumman, and toward newer partnerships like this involving emerging companies that 10 years ago people hadn't heard of?
Yeah, and we are at a time in history when the technology is happening so quickly and changing so quickly that we actually have to think different about how quick we can bring it in. And that's the basis of everything that you're talking about. Look, our primes have done a great job over the years of producing great pieces of equipment. It's the reason we have the greatest military in the world. But those traditional processes that the government employs, writing requirement documents, the budgeting process, the acquisition process, which the big primes have built their defense industry on, are probably not going to be fast enough or can't keep up with the pace that technology is actually developing, which is why these non-traditionals, Anduril being one of them, and you use some other examples, are teaming together to bring in technology at a much faster pace. And the reason that's important is because we are realizing in the department that some of the requirements we have are actually not that important. Some temperature variations. If it can't go to -70, I'm making up a number, to +130, then we don't want it. Well, maybe we actually do. If it doesn't go that well, we can take a commercial product and use that in a military application. And so these young startup companies, the non-traditionals, Anduril being one of them, our approach is, look, we'll follow a commercial model. We'll actually invest literally private dollars, venture capitalist dollars, on a product we have conviction on, and we'll present that to the government to buy, versus the traditional model, which is, here's an idea from the government, now go pay somebody to develop that government idea. That model is a little bit what I would call it in legacy thinking. What we need to bring to bear is the power of the commercial marketplace and the technology adaptation. 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, the government was driving technology. 90s, 2000s, today, commercial marketplace is driving technology. So we need to take advantage of that, and the non-traditional players are capitalizing on the speed of the commercial market adaptation and bringing that into the Defense Department.
Can we actually drill into this budgetary and acquisition process a little more? I mean, what do you see coming in terms of reforms to DoD contract and acquisition processes? There's a climate right now in Washington of cost cutting, efficiency, downsizing the workforce, getting smaller, cheaper, more agile. So it seems like the time might be right for changes to how the DoD does business at the ground level. Is it really just about the speed at getting new capabilities fielded? Is there more to it? What do you want to see happen on the acquisition reform landscape?
Yeah, I have a lot of passion on this, so I'll try to temper that passion a little bit as we do this. So I'll give you a couple of ideas. The first idea I would tell you, and this lived out true in the RCCTO and that 3-star organization we stood up. Acquisition reform, in my opinion, is more about behavior change than law change. It's about making intelligent and assume risk. Congress has given us lots of authorities. It's about how we use those authorities and how we do that quickly. In RCCTO, we went from a blank piece of paper on offensive hypersonic weapons fielded the unit in 23 months. We haven't done work at that pace since World War II. We didn't change any laws to do that. We changed the behavior to do that. And I think the leadership now more than ever, to your point, I agree 100%. They want that behavior change and they want people to take a different approach and be aggressive about that. Here's some things that we can think about differently. So generally, we buy stuff in the Department of Defense on a 20-year life cycle. In other words, we buy it and we plan on having it in the fight for 20 years. That's probably not the future. In other words, beyond capital equipment, right? Tanks, boats, helicopters, planes, stuff you're actually going to have around for a while. Everything else is not those kind of capital investments, really should be on a much shorter cycle. Technology is turning. I mean, does anybody believe that a counter UAS system we buy today is going to be effective on the battlefield in 2044 or 2045? The answer is probably not. But yet we hold ourselves to this 20-year buy idea, and it actually limits our what we can do. And so we have to realize that if I'm not going to buy it for 20 years and I'm going to buy it for 4 to 5 years, then I'm going to change equipment in the department at a much faster pace, which means my technology adaptation will be faster, which also means that I have to change how I do logistic support structures, how I train my soldiers. You know, when I was a young enlisted soldier, I was trained on a task, on a very specific product. In the commercial marketplace, they don't do that. They train on technology domains. And when they get to their company after they're done with school, they learn a very specific product at the company. That's probably where we need to go in the department, right? Train our soldiers on domains and then let them, when they get to the unit, train on very specific pieces of equipment within that domain. And then we can bring in the adaptation of technology much, much faster. When we simply say, we're going to buy this piece of technology and we're not going to look at another one for 20 more years, that's probably not the right approach. And we probably need to change that behavior. Now, the important part of that is, appropriately so, Congress wants to know how the department's spending that money. We need to be very transparent about that. And the way we show that is through our requirement documents. And maybe we should look at how we do our requirement generation process, which is tied to how we do our budget generation process, which is tied to how we execute. That chain is a behavior chain. It's not a law chain, it's a behavior chain. And when we want to do a thing very quickly, as I just gave an example in the RCCTO, we can behave differently. And part of the mission I had when I was in the RCCTO was to show the department across many programs that we can actually do things much quicker. The piece of that is important to recognize is that when you're doing fast in business, it's called fail fast, fail early. Before you decide to buy thousands of a thing, buy a small subset and try it. Actually try it with a combat unit and see if it does what it wants to do. And then we have to realize that those things we try sometimes are actually not going to work, and it's okay. Everything is not going to work all of the time.
Neil, we only have a couple minutes here left. So last thing, I want to try to tie a couple of those things together. I'm curious how this new approach to, we're not going to use this thing for 20 years. We might only use it for 3, 4, 5 years, or we're going to test this thing out in a combat scenario. How does that affect strategy and tactics at the service level? I mean, do you say, all right, if I was going to send human beings or manned aircraft into a situation, I'm not going to do it, but because I have these drones, these unmanned, these robots, these systems that, hey, frankly, I'm not expecting to have 3 or 4 years from now. Even in a best case scenario, let's send them in. If they get blown to bits, it doesn't matter. How does this stuff affect the decisions that are going to be made in war?
Yeah, the great staffs and the combatant commands, the operational staffs that are planning the war plans, those in the service that are writing the strategies of how we're going to train men and equip our soldiers to fight wars. I tell you, those are super great and super smart folks, and they're actually wrestling every day with this exact problem set. And it's not that we're not going to have unmanned things in 10 years. It's we just won't have the same ones, right? So the idea that we're going to have unmanned is a fundamental strategy. And then how do I bring that unmanned strategy? The actual platform of that we're using for the unmanned is less and less important because it's going to change so rapidly. But the warfighters are thinking about now, okay, how do I fly an unmanned system? I'll use just a broad example. How do I fly an unmanned system ahead of a manned aircraft, get the enemy threat radars to come online with an unmanned system, let them shoot their missiles at our unmanned systems to protect the manned aircraft, right? Today we don't do that. We fly a manned aircraft out there and we expect the human to fight that fight in real time and protect themselves and their aircraft and crews. And so there is this adaptation of technology that is directly tied to our strategies and how we fight wars. Here's the opposite side of that. Sometimes we have really great technology and we have to learn how to fight it. In other words, it's so good and it came so quickly. We have to think about fighting it as we're building it. When we were doing the offensive hypersonic weapons, General McConville, just a great leader who was the chief of staff of the Army, the material development of that was much faster than the doctrine that was being written to use it. And General McConville, the Army would say to me, "Hey, the material side is going super fast here. We need to catch up on the doctrine side." And General McConville, in my opinion, a great leader, said these words. You must have said it to me 1,000 times. Keep building it. We'll figure out how to fight it. And so we can't wait for strategy to be led by technology, and we can't wait for technology to lead strategy. It's a balance, and you got to use that balance for the most advantageous piece of the warfight to create dilemmas for the enemy, so that we can get our national outcomes achieved.
Neil Thurgood, thank you so much for joining us here in the Threat Status Podcast. Really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for the time today, Ben and Guy, and I appreciate all that you are doing for our nation, and of course our soldiers out there that are all of our service members that are doing our nation's bidding, and for the non-traditional companies who are trying to make a difference. So, and I appreciate all the work that Anduril does. Thank you.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here in the show where Guy and I each identify a threat, whether it's here at home, domestically, or in some corner of the world that we think is impacting U.S. national security this week, right now, as you're listening to the show. Guy, what do you have for us as your Threat of the Week?
My threat of the week, Ben, is that the U.S. Iran talks could result in a confrontation between the Trump administration and Tehran that leads to a U.S. bombing campaign against Iranian nuclear sites and basically a major conflagration of war in the Middle East. There are, I'm sure, some listeners who want that U.S. bombing campaign to happen. There are others, I'm sure, who are optimistic that suddenly there could be a diplomatic breakthrough between the U.S. and Iran under Trump, and that Iran ends its nuclear program. But my threat is that the stakes are incredibly high, and the possibility that the U.S.-Iran talks become a catalyst for conflict is just as real as the possibility that the talks result in any kind of sustainable diplomatic and security agreement.
High stakes, to say the least, on this one. My threat of the week is the sharing of sensitive information with AI, chatbots, and programs, and what that means for our security personally and as a country. A lot of us are guilty of this. Many of us don't think twice, myself included sometimes, about downloading apps on our phones and turning over addresses, phone numbers, even talking to bots. But what does that mean over the long term? And it might be dangerous. This week, the House Science Committee held a hearing on the potential national security threats from DeepSeek, the Chinese AI model. And some lawmakers said said there's a really dangerous environment taking shape as Americans become more and more willing to share personal information about their lives with these apps. What if a Chinese Communist Party controlled app is involved with your banking or your travel plans, your medical information? What if an AI app is helping you narrow down the list of schools or colleges you might want to send your kids to? You know, there's an old saying, guy, that once something is posted to the internet, it never really goes away, regardless of whether you try to delete it. That principle is true here, but potentially magnified times a lot, because if you give an AI app access to personal information, especially if those apps are controlled by a communist government that's actively hostile to the U.S. and wants to undermine our status as the global leader militarily and economically, they might have access to it forever in one form or another. And what do they want to do with it? So that's pretty dangerous. It's a good thing that it's in the spotlight and we're holding hearings about it. But right now, it's my threat of the week.
Very interesting, Ben. Sobering. Did you acknowledge in your thread, did I hear it right, that you talk to bots?
I have occasionally, yeah. It can be entertaining. You go down a rabbit hole talking to these bots, but you know, when you start digging into where that information's going, how it's being used, where it's being stored, who has access to it, I would encourage everyone to read the user agreements that we often just kind of flip through and ignore when you're using some of these things. So with that, thank you, Guy. As always, big thanks to Neil Thurgood from Anduril for coming on the Threat Status Podcast, and a huge thanks to all of you, our listeners. Go ahead, hit that subscribe button. Guy and I will be back next week on the Threat Status Podcast.